will be talking about fish biodiversity, ecosystem services at Cranberry Lake, New York.
Great, so good morning everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'm going to be talking about some of the work I was doing up at Cranberry. I'm a master's or PhD student in Josh Drew's lab at SUNY ESF. I'm going to be talking about some of the work I did at Cranberry Lake last summer alongside the undergraduates, co-authors Jordan, Jamie, and Bella. We're all up there helping me with this. So just a little bit of background on Cranberry Lake for those of you not as familiar with the area. It is located in the Five Ponds Wilderness region of the Adirondacks, and it's the third largest Adirondack lake. It has a maximum depth of just under 12 meters. However, since this lake was created by damming, it also has large areas of shallow bays, so the mean depth is just below 2 meters. The DEC manages this lake for brook trout, but bass and northern pike are also popular game fish. So ESF has had a presence on this lake for over a century through the Cranberry Lake Biological Station and the Ranger School. In this figure, I have my advisor and I at Cranberry last year on the right, and my great-grandfather there in 1916 is a student on the left. So for a really long time, this has been an important site for coursework, as all of the undergraduate students in our department take their introductory field class there, and also for research. So the initial interest in this project kind of stemmed from just an interest in having an up-to-date species list for use in the classes, so the instructors and students could have ideas about what the common fish around the field station are. But this kind of rapidly developed into an interest in changes over time in the lake, that we know the lake has experienced those changes, and I've even heard from a few faculty members who've been teaching courses at Cranberry Lake for multiple decades that they see different fish around the station now than they used to. In the fish atlas records for Cranberry, there have been 30 species recorded in the past century, but many of those records are old, that for 14 of those 30 species, they haven't been detected since prior to 1970, and a lot of those species are also only represented by a few observations. So this is a lake that we know has experienced some major changes over the past century. So we were curious in investigating just how the species richness changed, what portion of those kind of 30 species that have ever been in the lake are there today. That kind of leads us into these some kind of larger research questions, thinking about what is the value of a disturbed lake once experienced some of these major changes. And we can think from the perspective of ecosystem services, of anglers, kind of how might angler habits have changed as the fish community has changed, and so how people have both driven and responded to some of these shifts. So a brief timeline of Cranberry Lake and some of the changes it has experienced. That people have been present in the Adirondacks since time immemorial through indigenous peoples such as the Mohawk Nation, but the degree of anthropogenic impact really starts to intensify in the mid-1800s through logging in the region. Cranberry Lake is first dammed in the 1860s as a way to be floating this timber out, and the dam height is raised in 1910, which brings us to the current lake dimensions we have today. The DEC's biologic watershed surveys that they've done throughout the state in the 20s and 30s, the Oswegatchie River watershed, where this lake is, was surveyed in 1931. This gives us kind of some of our baseline information about what species were present then. Around 1945, yellow perch are introduced to the lake. In the early 1960s, smallmouth bass are stocked and begin doing very well in the lake. Acid rain affect kind of areas throughout the Adirondacks in the mid-20th century. By the 1970s, papers are starting to be published on impacts in the region. And then our most recent major disturbance is sometime around 1991, northern pike are first introduced to Cranberry Lake. So as we see, given this history of change the lake has experienced, we can have these two questions, one from the biological side and then one from this human side. That we want to know biologically, what has the impact of stocking and of these species introductions been on the fish community? And then from the human side, wonder what species are providing ecosystem services to people in the area and what species are the ones the anglers prioritize. So for our biological survey, we were out in June and July last summer. We set trap nets and or minnow traps at 54 sites around the lake itself and kind of on the side there where the Oswegatchie River is joining the Cranberry Lake. These were all set for approximately 24 hours, and additionally, we set minnow traps at another 15 sites in some of the streams feeding into the lake. So we in total captured 496 fish in these nets. All of them were identified, counted, and measured. And I'll offer a little teaser maybe for next year's AFS meeting that Jordan and Jamie, the two undergraduates working on these biological surveys, also did a project looking at why fish in Cranberry Lake might have such a high rate of cataracts. So that'll be something, maybe stay tuned next year's AFS for one of them to present. So in terms of our species richness, this first graph is for all of the trap nets and minnow traps in the lake, the streams, and the Oswegatchie River. And here we have 13 species. There are the 12 present on this graph, and additionally, I know that northern pike are in the lake. Anglers showed me their northern pike they'd caught and exactly where they caught them, and we just could not get one in a trap net. So we have these 12 species plus northern pike. It's a fairly even mix of native and non-native species. That we have brown bullhead and pumpkin seed as our most common native fish, and pumpkin seed were our most common fish overall, with almost 200 individuals. And then golden shiners and rock bass were the two most common introduced species. But again, even here, in kind of looking throughout the watershed, we have 13 species as opposed to the nearly 30 that have been recorded in the lake in all time. Now, if we narrow our scope a little bit and exclude those stream sites and the Oswegatchie and only look at the lake itself, there we only have 9 species in the survey, and only 2 of those are native. That we still have the brown bullhead and the pumpkin seed, but we don't have white suckers that we had in the river, and we don't have some of those minnow species or the brook trout that we found in the streams. We still have the same number of non-native species though, again with golden shiners and rock bass as the 2 most common species. So as we can see there from this biological survey, that this long anthropogenic history of species introductions and alterations has had a really strong impact on the fish present. That we've had this major reduction in species richness, and of the species we lost, it's primarily been things like a lot of the native minnows and some of the sucker species. That this is likely due to the effect of introduced predators, that my advisor likes to describe these suckers and minnows as lozenge-shaped. There's things that can very easily be eaten by a pike or a bass, so those are the species that were disproportionately affected. So we now kind of see this current state of a reduced species richness and a high proportion of introduced species. So the second question we were interested in looking at is, given the change in the fish community, how might that affect the anglers? What do they think about all of that? So we were interested in investigating what ecosystem services the lake provides to people, and are those services tied to specific species, or are they kind of roles that any game fish can fulfill? We wanted to know if people fish for food, for recreation, if they have any preference for native or non-native species, so essentially have introduced species affected the way that they interact with the lake, and where angler priorities lie. So I've gone out again in June and July last summer to do these angler surveys. That I in total talked to 23 groups representing 51 individuals, that 18 of these interviews were just me going out on a motorboat or on the canoe in this picture to talk to a boat as people were fishing, and an additional 5 interviews took place at the Cranberry Lake boat launch. A partial question list included demographic information, the number of years people had fished on the lake for, the species they targeted, and the species that are most important to them, which were not always the same answer, whether they eat what they catch, if it matters to them if the species are native or non-native, and essentially what benefits overall they get from a healthy lake. So anglers were visiting Cranberry Lake from 7 different states. There are people from as far as California, Arizona, and South Carolina who were flying in specifically to spend part of their summer at Cranberry. The majority of anglers were from New York, and so if we look specifically at those visitors from New York, they were primarily from the Great Lakes region, from Buffalo through Rochester, and a lot clustered around Plattsburgh and Adirondack Park. It's also an interesting question of when anglers began fishing at Cranberry Lake. So this histogram just shows the number of people who began fishing in each decade. That our oldest respondent had been fishing at Cranberry Lake for over 70 years, since the 1950s, and the most recent respondent was visiting Cranberry Lake for the first time. This is interesting too when we think about how the fish community has changed. By knowing how long someone has fished there, we know kind of which of those areas they have experienced. That largemouth and smallmouth bass were introduced early in the 1960s, so we only get one respondent who could remember a time before the bass were present. As opposed to northern pike, showing up in the 1990s, there we have about a 50-50 split of people who remember, who brought it up in their surveys, how different the lake was before the pike were there, versus anglers for whom the pike had just always been part of that fish community. This really gets into the idea of shifting baselines, which is the phenomenon where people take the conditions in their youth or when they first arrive at a site as what's normal. So longer term changes occurring over decades sort of go unnoticed if everyone is taking their conditions as what was normal at the time. It was interesting, this really came up in the interviews a lot, that almost everyone I talked to thought that Cranberry Lake's fish were mostly native, in contrast to that graph we saw that they're most introduced. A lot of people talked about bass being a native species. So with this longer term change, people's views of what the lake should look like also changed. So we're still in the process of doing the full coding for these interview data, but some preliminary key takeaways that the most popular target by far was bass, followed by northern pike and crappier panfish. I guess with one little asterisk here that these surveys were during the summer during bass season, so that may have skewed those results a little bit. The species that were most important to anglers, again, bass were mentioned the most often, but all of them was our second most common response, that we have people who talked about the importance of balance and having a variety of fish in the community. We also saw trout appearing on the list of fish most important to people. The majority of anglers, about 2/3, fished catch and release, and of the ones who weren't eating what they caught, they said it was not a major part of their diet, it was more something that was fun over the summer to occasionally keep a fish they caught. Most people didn't express any preference for native or non-native fish, but again, with those shifting baselines, people did think bass and a lot of those introduced species were native. And the list of benefits people got from the lake that were frequently mentioned included recreation, with things like camping, fishing, and swimming, relaxation, the economic impact of bringing tourists to the region, and time with family. There's a lot of discussion for people of their family and their connections to the lake. That was one of the things that people spent the most time talking about when I surveyed them. That there were a father and son who were out together, with the father really expressing how much he loves taking his son fishing and how much he hopes his son is someday going to bring his own kids there. There was one respondent whose house had been in the family with his grandparents first, then his parents, now it's his, and even though he lives out of state, he flies back every summer with his kids and grandkids and plans to pass the house on to his kids someday. There was someone whose wife's family had owned their Cranberry house for 100 years. Another man and his wife were in their 60s who owned their Cranberry camp and said they'd been coming there for their entire marriage. So we really see here that even though Cranberry Lake has experienced these major disruptions to its ichthyofauna, it still provides really valued ecosystem services to people from around the country. We saw that reduction from 30 to 13 species, but people expressed the economic importance of the lake, of the tourism that it brings in, as well as the kind of cultural importance, those connections, the recreation, and how people really strongly tied it to their childhoods and their families. So going back to the question I posed at the beginning of the talk of what the value is of a disturbed lake, it can still really resonate to the people on it. And in these cases, it was people who had specific connections to Cranberry Lake that couldn't just be replaced by any Adirondack lake. This kind of leads us to some larger thoughts, and even one of the themes of this AFS meeting, thinking about conservation and management of fisheries in a changing world, that kind of how do we do conservation in the Anthropocene in situations where we might never be able to return to reference conditions. If we can't undo change, how do we learn to live with that? And while we see through work like this that it's very important to try to protect the ponds and the streams without introducing predators where we still see native minnow species, conservation of a lake like Cranberry, where once we have bass and pike, we're unlikely to ever really get rid of them, we see the importance of managing for the ecosystem services and making the best of what we have. So acknowledgements. This funding for this work was provided by the Cranberry Lake Biological Station. I want to thank our director, Emily Arsenault, and assistant directors, Terrence Cavanis and Kit Sheehan, for their support through the summer. I also want to thank Dr. Farrell and the Adirondack Fish Ecology class, as well as the EFB 202 students, who I spent a lot of time out in the field sampling fish with. As with my techs Jordan and Jamie, sampling on some beautiful days and some wildfire smoke apocalypse days. And so with that, are there any questions?